Welcome back to the channel, guys. We want to show you guys how to make a repair on something that is not really a big repair. I mean, it is, but it isn't. But I want you guys to be educated on knowing, look at your work and come back and understand if you're having blisters or peeling or you chipped it or whatever it may be, how do you guys fix that? Today we're going to cover all the steps in the domino effect, as I call it, on once you dig into something, how bad is it and how do you guys go about fixing that problem? We have an area that delaminated all the way from edge to edge, and until we dig into it like this, a lot of times we don't know where we made a problem. And this should really apply to all of you guys, whether it be a cancer repair bubble or a crack in the body fill, or maybe you chipped the edge of the door. I want you guys to understand what goes into repairing something the right way. There's a ton of ways that you can slice any one of these repairs, and I want you guys to know what does that right way look like and how involved is fixing something like this. Maybe you're a shop and you're just trying to educate your customer on why does that cost so much. Well, you can't just fix this. We can't just put filler here, blend it out. I mean, I guess you could. Some guys probably would do that. But you cannot just put clear right here. You have to go all the way from a split in color all the way to the end of the body edge, front, rear, and the fender lip to repair something like this to look seamless. It's always good if you're painting your car and you're going to start painting your car to buy way more base coat than you need and mix it all at one time. We have videos on how to paint an entire car and the steps that we did in that. So if you guys want to know more on that, check it out. But the biggest thing here is I want you to understand what goes into a repair, because if this repair was closer to the door, we would have to take the molding off of the door and blend this color. Even though we have the original paint from this car, the metallics will lay differently. Now, I talk also in that paint video about how we set up our gun and making sure that we document what pressure, what mixture, what was the viscosity, and everything so we can mimic this exact same paint job again. But what if you're a shop that didn't have any of that information and you're just fixing the repair of somebody else's car? It's always good to have enough surface area. Like right here, we have a decent amount of space between the edge of this repair and that door. But if I do that and I sand, what we want to do is we want to sand this all back. We kind of started knocking it down a little bit. We are using 80 grit, and we got to get this sharp edge where what had happened here was we had painted the fender and we had a ripple right here. In that ripple, I wasn't happy with it, and so we re-sanded, we wet sanded the whole thing in 600 grit, and then we went back through and we tried to float just this ripple with a little skim coat of filler and then re-prime it back in. But what had happened was it was fresh clear. We made this repair, we painted the car, we made the repair very quick to one another, and the clear is gassing off for a good 30 days or more, depending on the clear that you use. And if we take 80 grit like this and we dig into new clear, you are opening it up to where the reducers that are still drying and gassing off have to exit. And I think what had happened here was we scuffed up that clear. There's a few things that could have happened in this. Is when we opened that back up, it wasn't dry enough, and it wants to pop off the filler in this area. So now that it's been a couple of years, this car is super dry, we're able to come back through and feather all this stuff out. We'll make our repair. And then the other thing that I want you guys to know is that if you're doing any body filler over something like this, you need to have enough of a tooth that filler is going to grab. So just as an example, this isn't what we did, but if you wet sand the whole fender and prep the whole thing edge to edge, you need to have enough of a grit in the area that you're going to put some body filler that it can actually grab. And I think that maybe we had put it over 220, not 100% sure because I don't have the footage or the pictures of that process in between. However, What I would like to teach in our other videos and in our classes is that you want to put filler over anything from 80 grit to 150 grit. Anything finer is almost too smooth, and that filler is not really going to adhere. If it's a glazing putty, you can get away with other things, but the biggest here is longevity. I want our paint jobs and your guys' paint jobs to last. So we're going to scuff all this stuff up with 80 grit in the area that's affected and get it to where it can blend. Now, it's thicker right here where we had added filler in between. Not much, it was just a ripple, but it's enough that getting rid of this edge, we basically have to dig and dish this area to be smooth. And as you get close to the thin part where it starts to smooth, if you see the product starting to pull and want to lift, you have to keep going until you see it sticking good. Otherwise, you're just going to have another problem right next to where you just fixed. You always see the videos where a guy masked it off and then they get all this done painted and they pull the tape and it rips the white off next. So we're gonna dish this out. You can use a DA at this point. You could use a hand block. I don't really use DAs much for body work. I don't want to affect our finish overall. I just want to take this back to where we have good adhesion between the two. As we work this whole area down, I don't want to cause a small issue to be a very big repair. So that's kind of why I'm using a smaller block. Obviously here, all I'm really concerned about is getting this feathered out to where everything is not pulling back. And what I mean by that is if we go over here and we look, I can still, see how thin this is? I can actually still, now that it's feathered, but it's not completely grabbing, we need to get rid of everything that is still peeling or it's just going to delaminate again. We need to get it all the way feathered out to what's sticking and good. So here is feathered and out here you can see is still. If you have that hard edge, you just need to make sure it's completely blending between the two. These little blocks are those next level blocks. They have different kits. They have our big kit, or not our big kit, his big kit that you can do that are 24, 22 inches, somewhere in there, and all different thicknesses. But these small guys that he has for doing a little repair like this, or maybe it's just a body line, it has so much flexibility that it will contour to these shapes real nice and then let you blend out these shapes. As you sand this down, I don't know if this shows up or not, right here is blending, and right here along this edge is still peeling off as we go. We need it to look just like this and not where you can take your fingernail and still scrape it off. Notice how I went just a 1/4 inch past that and now it's blending. It down here is stuck nice. It was just in here where we were getting rid of our ripple before where we have to get this completely feathered out. So we're going to just work through this all the way around, feathering this out, and we're going to make sure that we keep our 80 grit tooth within our area that we're going to do any fill work, and then blend this back in. We're trying to not be as invasive, but being such a big area, we don't want to see a ripple when we're done either. We may have to break out the bigger blocks and just lightly feather it through. So we'll bring you back when we get this thing completely feathered out. Now that we have gotten everything feathered out, you can see the process that we had. This is the initial paint job that we first put on the car, because then we found the ripple, and when we came in, we added a very thin skim coat of filler, is what you're seeing here. And then you're seeing the white right in between that got oversprayed before we did the blue, the round of primer, and then paint. So right now, if you fill this panel, it is dished out in this area. So we want to make sure that we have the tooth that we need the filler to stick to at this point. All of this stuff is a couple years dry. We're not worrying about things gassing off at this point. And we're going to come through with Rage Ultra and Ultra Extra mixed, so we have a little bit more time. It is a warm day today. And we're going to come through and we're going to spread. Now the goal here, I'm not going to worry about anything up here at this point, because all we're trying to do is make this face, this finish, back what it was. What I'm going to do is I have a next level block. This is 1/4 inch thick. I've cut them in half so I could work a smaller section, because if I have the 24-inch block, I'm going to be over here into the fender and door where I don't want to put scratches. I'm going to try to keep this centralized only in this area and just get this body work. Well, if you put this body filler on here and you let it dry completely, it's going to be a lot harder, a lot more work to make this finish seamless. So if you guys want to know more about that, watch the video we did on body filler where we talk about weighing it on the scale and making sure you're precise with your mixture and what time frame that you actually sand the filler. That's the biggest thing that we get in our classes is we're doing a lot more metal work than when we used to do this car a couple years back. So from metal finishing to doing body work and all that stuff, we go through all the details that it takes to make this something that's going to last and not have a problem that's going to come back. But at the time, we didn't know what we didn't know, and neither do you guys while you're watching this video. So we're going to mix up some filler, and we're going to use this block, and we're going to come through and feather this out so where we can come in and have an area that's prepped for primer, and we'll bring it back for some filler. All right, the biggest thing here is making sure that you're pushing this filler into those scratches. And we're using a metal spreader to make sure that we can come up here with our finger placement on what is flat and what is good. We're not looking to try to fill this all in one pass. We want to do this slowly. If it takes us a couple times, it's actually more precise than trying to do it all at one shot, because you're keeping your sanding down to a minimum and keeping the filler right where you need it. And you can see I didn't prep up here because I want that filler to come right off. So I can bend the spreader and feather my edge. A lot of people that we teach, that's the biggest thing they struggle with, is trying to put all the filler on in one pass and fighting this hard edge. If you feather your edge every time and just put on the filler that you need and sand it in the time frame that you need, you won't struggle with this near as much. But you really want to make sure that you spend the time getting the best spread that you can. It's going to make it a lot easier later to sand. I don't care so much about this rounded radius. I just want to get a little bit of filler on there to start feathering it out. And then I'm going to come back through the top. Think about this as like pizza dough. You want to work it all the way across, ironing it out. Smoother the spread, the easier it is to sand. If your body filler looks rough from the beginning, it's going to be rough to sand. So there, we've got that edge. Now I want to come back with just a little bit here. A little shaky. And then I'm going to clean off my spreader to act as a spline. That's what we want. I don't mind that stuff. I can come back in and touch that up after. And then just feather that edge. The amount of sanding that we're going to have to do here is very little compared to just hoofing it on and having it thick. If you're struggling with filler work, spend more time trying to get the spread right. And if you're new to filler, that's why I recommend Rage Ultra and Rage Ultra Extra mixed together 50-50, because it gives you way more time to practice and learn the filler than going to any other that doesn't give you enough time to even practice what you need. Guys that do a lot of drywall usually do this a lot better, but this is the one thing that we do teach a lot in our classes is how to spread, how to apply it, how to make sure it's got a good tooth, and what is the time frame to sand this. It's not when it's completely hard. And if you guys want to know any more about our classes and what we're going to be having coming up, look up sylvesterscustoms.com. We have all of our class schedules for this year posted for next year, and we'll try to stay up to date with that. We have gone through and spreaded the filler. We've pushed it into the scratches really good. Now, here's where a lot of people, I think, miss the mark. When it comes to sanding filler, we're always focusing on the low instead of focusing on the high. Right now we have our spread lines. We want to focus on just getting rid of our high points more so than watching the low. Because what happens is if you start blocking this thing and you start seeing lows, you just sit there with your hand over the low area, and what you're doing is causing ripples. All we want to do is stop just shy of being where we need to be. And this filler, depending on the weather, takes a while to set up. It's going to be faster to just put on little bits at a time. And if you look, I don't know if it shows up, we can't move the line. It's not moving it, but it's sticky. Filler is drying from the bottom up. And what we want to do is utilize the fact that it is easier to sand right now. So I'm using the real flexible next level block with a nice fresh piece of 80 grit. If it's fresh like this, we're not looking to take it all the way down flat and transition. We're just looking to get rid of our high areas, our lines. So we're just going to use our fingertips, and you can see how easily it smooths out. See how it rolls off? But think about how much harder that is to sand when it's hard. If you focus on putting it on smooth, this becomes a lot easier to do body work. I try to tell people that if you are doing body work and you think it's difficult, you're probably doing it wrong. I would rather smoke a piece of sandpaper clogging it, just slowly dialing it in with ease, than work extremely hard at trying to make a shape. This is a hard transition for a lot of people to get this body line back. So focus on just putting on what you need where you need it. And then when you need a little bit more here and there, just add it as you need it. Don't try to do this in one shot. So right there, we got rid of the lines going this direction. Now we have this little lip from when we did the last skim through. So I don't want to dig a moat in this thing. I just want to place this block and just shave down ever so slightly that little groove and cut it off. Every time you get closer to the end result, this is going to spread better and better and better. So just, you're basically acting as like a cheese grater at this point because it's soft. That's what the whole cheese grater thing is for. If you have an edge like this, well, then just come in and lightly feather out that edge just till you see it blend, and then leave it alone. What we're doing is utilizing the soft state of the filler to carve our shape that we need, our body line, get rid of all these little highs. And then when it's all the way dry or drier, we can come in with the bigger, thicker next level block, and just by fingertips we can dial this bodywork in. That way we're not trying to push. One, if you push too hard, you're causing ripples. Two, if you have a longer block and you're trying to push to get through that thick filler, you're going to end up messing up the fender's finish down the way to where you're going to end up having to blend out the door. If you make it smooth and almost the shape you need in the beginning, it's a lot easier. I don't want to use this block to try to get my body work straight, because this block is a 1/16 of an inch thick where the acrylic is. I want to use something thicker like this. And now that we have all of the majority of the high points out, we can bring in this block and just real light, not pushing hard. By going really light is going to show me what is high and what is low. And we just slowly work it around. Also, your fingertips or wherever your hand is where the block is going to do the majority of the damage. If the block is riding out here into the clear, we might add a few little scratches here and there, but the goal is that we're not making this straightness go away. Even if you just drag it real light. As the filler dries, this won't clog as much. You see the majority of it comes out. And now if we had to smoke that piece, put a new one on, it's going to cut really, really good. Now, we've gotten this pretty straight. Like you can see right here is flat, but right here where we need a little bit more, we'll come in once we get this lip more to shape. We clogged that because it was really soft in the beginning. So we're just going to put a little piece on. Now we're going to just real lightly, like Bob Ross, happy little trees. I'm using my finger and I'm curving the block to the shape of the car and slowly working. This filler is still a little bit on the soft side. It's almost all the way dry. When you're in 80 grit to 150 grit, we are, or even 80 to 100, 120, you're doing more shaping at that point. Anything above that, all we're doing is removing sand scratches and imperfections. And I don't care if I cut a little bit of a line, because I've got to come in and add a little bit more filler anyway. We can get rid of that line. You're basically doing the same thing you're doing out here. You're using what is good to spread against and feather out. And then the next spot that's low, you add a little more, and now you'll have this area that will put a pencil line, and you'll be able to follow it and watch it. But if you waited till this completely dried, you would not be able to sculpt this quite as precise out of the gate. Very light touch. Not going too far. As soon as you see it start to get thin or start to blend out with the shape, stop. Like that. We've completely blended right here. Just have a little bit more. Notice I'm not blocking more in here. I'm not taking the smaller block that flexes and I'm getting into there because that's just ripples. All I want to do is do light pressure so that way I know it's dead flat all the way across. Another thing that we try to really emphasize on and teach is that even though this block is riding this entire area, your finger pressure on where you push and where you hold is a direct reflection of how much it's going to wear away. If we know out here is higher and I need this to flow out gently, my finger placement is more on the upward side and I'm just holding the block on the sides to be able to maintain side to side motion. But really, the majority of my feathering out is up here, constantly moving around to feather out where the pressure is. I don't want my finger, if I know I got a low here, the last thing I want is my finger down here pressing. It's going to push that block directly in here. 1/4 inch block is still flexible enough that you'll get ripples in your car. So I can use a 1/4 inch because it boils down to the touch, that light touch. When we are knocking the bulk of the filler down, you can use a little bit more pressure to boogie through that. And then as it becomes dry and flatter, you can then apply less and less pressure. The thought there is, it's like skydiving, right? We are moving at the fastest speed right out of the plane, and right before you hit the ground, we ease up on pressure and have a smooth landing. It's the same thing with filler. So just be gentle. Now, let me grab a pencil, and we're going to mark where we still need our filler, and we'll come in and add a little more. So I don't know if it shows in the camera, but this over here is definitely, it's hitting where the filler is getting a little bit of a scratch through it, but it's not dead flat up in here. Could we do it with primer? Potentially, but the goal is I want to prime this thing one time and I don't want to have to come back and add filler, reprime again. So I'm going to mark out specifically where I want to put my filler, and I make squiggles where I know is good. And then what I will do is I'll leave here. I'll even put notes as I'm filling, or maybe you're passing it off to somebody else to fix. I know I got to come through and dial in this edge a little bit more. But overall, that is where I want it. At this point, you can't just put filler there. I'm going to take a piece of 150 grit at best. You can use 120. The reason that I use that to pivot, you can use 80 if you want, but if we think about what 80 does, an 80 grit is a bigger tooth. The fingers are wider apart. They're not as close. It's going to grab more. It's like using your garden rake that's metal versus a leaf rake. It's the same analogy. So if you are coming out here, this is almost perfect. Well, what do we want to do? We want to have enough of a tooth that the filler grabs, but we don't want it so smooth that the filler will not grab the scratch. So pick your poison. Anything from 80 grit to 150 grit will come in and we'll just lightly put a tooth on these little green areas, and then I'll come back in with my filler and repeat. And as we wear the filler down, you will get a hint of this pencil start to show. As soon as the pencil starts to show, not fully shown, you want to then upgrade in grits. We'll use some dry guide coat, some Mirka black powder, and we will coat over this on all of the scratches. And we will take all of this body work that we've done here, and we will feather it to at a minimum 150 grit scratch. At that point, I will use some 400 grit, and we'll go through and prep all of this, and I will mask way out beyond where I'm going to prime, and I will just make sure that I feather the primer when we go to recoat this. So let's mix up some more filler, and we'll come into these little areas and just finish it off to make sure this is nice and straight. The lighter the touch, the straighter the panel. And notice my finger placement too is more towards the top, not the bottom. I'm just trying to make sure I have enough filler where I need it. And then I'll make sure my finger placement is more towards the top to middle. And I will ride that groove and go slow. The faster you go, the more pinholes you're going to have and fight. Swipe out this little bit right here. And a spline is the same thing, essentially. But if you don't have the right pressure and the right speed, it will be choppy or it'll have air pockets in it. You want to keep working the filler as much as you can. So I've got everything on the upper side done. Now I'm just coming back in. For all I know, I might just be filling in 80 grit scratches to use with the 150 to get rid of, but I just want a little bit of filler on that edge to just feather it up. There's going to be a lot of guys that probably chime in with.
Chime in.
Yeah, that's pretty good, huh? Chime in and the ring camera goes off. On what they would use with glazing putty. I personally don't like glazing putty much because if it's a little pinhole you're trying to get rid of with glazing putty, when you go to sand it, some of it's going to be in there, some of it's not. If you use a good primer, the primer, if you have a couple pinholes, they'll go away. But you can see we have this radius now. It got shaped on the first round. The second round, we're just looking for uniform spread so we can sand it even lighter. And then now, I want to come through with one more spread. Now, if you do this and there's no filler there to go, this little wall that we're about to create is what's going to drag that from having voids in between. I'm just building a little bit of a wall. Clean my spreader off so I don't have excessive filler there. Now, we're going to just do even pressure, slow, and work this through. And if you have a void, do it again. Void. But out here is pretty dang good. So I'm going to reposition my body farther this way because if you're perpendicular to the panel, you have no control. If you're close to the panel, I can drag my whole torso with the panel and I can be a lot more smooth than I can just moving your elbow. Move your whole body so you have a good spread. A little bit of filler. Because you can see if I don't have enough filler, I get a void. So now we're come back, we're going to add a little bit more filler in this area right here. Right? So that way I can drag it on through. One little tiny void right there, and it's probably higher than what I need, so I'm going to leave that be. And I'm just going to come through at the top with it completely angled out and just smooth out this transition. We know these were really easy, these lines, so I don't want to come back in and risk bumping the top. I like the spread of the top. We're just slowly bringing it out with ease. We don't want to work hard. We don't want to push hard. The lighter the better it's going to come out, and the more you won't even know we had a problem. So we'll let this dry up just like we did on the first round, feather it out, and then when it's completely dry, we will then come in with 150 grit. Okay. Now that we've gotten everything roughed out, the most common problem that I see on the people doing body work is that they just take the body work a little bit too far. The whole goal here was that we have pencil marks, and if it shows up, they're very, very faint. You almost want the filler to look a little bit transparent, but not completely show up. The reason that is if you have an 80 grit scratch, that bigger tooth, versus we talk about like the rakes, you know, all metal steel rake being the 80 grit widespread versus like a leaf rake, where we're going to upgrade this to 150 grit. You're getting a lot finer of a tooth, and now you're going to start seeing where we have the two different spreads kind of come together. What we're going to do here is we're going to use Mirka dry guide coat to get in all of the 80 grit scratches. I still don't have out here prepped yet. It's not a big deal, but I'm going to make sure the dry guide coat gets everywhere I need it. We don't want to prime over anything that's 80 grit. We want to make sure at a minimum we're 150 grit before we prime. Some guys don't put this on that heavy. That's okay, but you're going to miss stuff. This is the next level block. Again, same block that we started with. And what we've done is we put the Sunmite brand 150. I know if you're using a specific filler or a specific sandpaper, you may like or not like the way that that sands or the way that that feels. Me personally, I like the Sunmite brand with the Rage filler. I may not like it with a different filler. But what we're going to do here is we're going to come in. We talked about when you're in 80 grit, you can rough things and you can push a little bit harder. Now that we're in 150 grit, we're going to use a little bit lighter pressure. Lighter and lighter and lighter. We want the more imperfections to show. You can kind of see right here and around here where we've done the second spread. So what we want now is we want to basically tie this all in, act as pizza dough, right? This is our roller, and we want to make sure that this is all now uniform. What was two spreads, we want to make look uniform and one. Right out of the gate, we can see that this is slightly higher. We purposely added where the little bits of lows were, and we can barely see a pencil mark showing. What the goal is that you end up right back to your pencil mark showing fully, or even that it gets removed slightly, so that way this is completely uniform. We don't want to sit here and wear straight grooves. We want to be going at an angle into this crevice in the fender where it changes shape and go uniformly through the whole thing. And this should start to slowly iron out until we see the pencil nice and good and we can verify. Me, I will take everything down to 150 grit. A lot of times I like to re-guide coat that area and then go back through with the same grit just a little bit lighter. You can go to 220, not a problem. You're just going to see more and more the lighter the grit you go. As this becomes more uniform, notice how my pencil line is showing up real nice and clear. You can see where the initial low was, and even in here where we had marked. The whole goal is that you're using your pencil line, your primer that's below your filler, or your bare metal that's even below that as a guideline as to where to stop. You don't want to keep going. If you have pencil marks, that was where you were flat to begin with. Make sure that the pencil line either just cleans up and only the primer below is showing. You don't want to have like metal start to show up in areas and you just keep sanding, because you're just taking everything else down and the metal is not going to go down. You're just going to make it thinner and thinner. So know what is a high and what is a low, and constantly pivot to make sure that is uniform. The other thing, as I go through this, I'm using one hand with a 1/4 inch block, and that's going to have a lot more flexibility in the panel. But if I'm holding it lightly, I'm only grazing those areas to make it perfectly flat. If we were doing this as the initial, where we're body working the whole fender, I would have a longer block, 2 hands, and keep even pressure and always move. But as long as you guys focus on the areas that are high, not the areas that are low, and you bring everything down to those baselines, those pencil marks, or bare metal, or epoxy primer, and just make sure that you stop when you barely see them. That is the biggest key to helping you dial in your body work. Again, just to reiterate from the beginning, I will not make sure that this filler is completely dry. I will always sand it in the softer stage. I've had guys tell me that, no, you're gonna make the filler delaminate. No, you have to find the sweet spot. It's not where you're pulling it off the panel because it's too soft. You're only taking a little bit off the high. Focus on making sure your spread is good and smooth and doesn't have a bunch of mountain ranges in your spread or pinholes or thick edges. Try to get everything to look as smooth as you can and creep up on perfection instead of trying to hoof it all off in one shot. This way is a lot less work. We only have maybe 30 minutes maybe of time in this outside of waiting for it to dry. Now we've got the small little flexible next level block. This has been changed to 150 grit, and I'm just going to slowly work out these scratches. But in here, you can see everything in here is nice and flat. I have to prep everything out here, so I step out the grit. 80 grit, we focused in here. 150, I'm going to step out a little bit more, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to prep everything out here with 400 grit. And just because this paint job now has sat for a couple years, I will take 400 dry, same kind of paper, and I'll take a little bit longer of a block right before we do any of our priming and just see if I have any slight ripples that I can take care of. I don't want to be chasing a ripple close to my edge where I got to add primer, because I need that original color of the base to match the door. I don't want to spray all the way to the end of the fender. I want to be blending this out. And the reason that we have taped it far away from my scratches is because I'm going to make sure that when I primer this, I don't want a tape line. I want it to just kind of blend out. And as I sand away the primer, I want this to look this way. I want it to be feathered. I don't want to see a hard line. You will see that at the end when you actually paint the car. Once you get everything ironed out with 150, make sure you go around your perimeter and get rid of all those 80 grit marks. The whole reason that we like to prime over 150 is if you think about the actual scratch being a V groove carved into, whether it be the paint, the filler, primer, If you have primer that goes into that groove and it's an 80 grit scratch that's really wide, as those products dry and shrink over time, we're not talking about a week, 2 weeks, a month, we're talking long term, months, years. The more that this product shrinks down, the more that you will see that scratch start to reveal itself when you are done later. I know there's been projects that have come back over the years of experiencing this where you constantly evaluate what you see later down the road versus what you're doing right now. And you can always make a pivoting point on what grit you change. At a minimum, 150 grit will win a prime, but 220 grit would be even better. Just know that you're shaping 80 to 150, and anything after 150, you're just refining scratches and blemishes. As you can see out here, we have our 80 grit scratches still. Now that we went through and you saw the very abrupt fills that we started seeing in the beginning, I'm going to re-guide coat this again and put a nice new piece of 150 on here. I'm going to grab a little bit longer of a block, and I'm just going to make sure that I'm making this uniform. Instead of one-handing it, I'm going to refine it with two hands through this area, because if I do have any kind of ripples in this area, I can take care of them at this stage because we have a different color. It's not adjoining to another panel. This is the end up here, so it's not important as far as it is where your fender to door is. So I'm going to grab a 24-inch block and come back at it. Depending on how much clear you have, now we know what clear we have on this car and we know how much we have left. I'm not as concerned about those deeper scratches that are farther out to the end of the fender, because I know there's enough clear here that I'm going to come back in with 400 grit and I'm going to make sure that everything from here, well, wherever there's no base coat showing, so let's call it in this area, that I can remove all of these scratches to 400 grit. Now that's going to give me from here to the edge of my fender to make my blend and not have to worry about trying to cover with primer a scratch or an issue with sealer or whatever it may be. So I just went through here to make sure that I can see if there's any choppiness. Even though the car's been cut and polished, this car was only cut with 1,000 grit. So with this being 150 and light pressure, I'm just checking to see how much choppiness do we have, how much shrinkage has occurred over that last 2 years. Now, this is where we had a little blemish that caused a lot of the stuff, and you can still see after things have dried and soaked up, that issue is still very noticeable. It's not a huge noticeable thing on the car, but with just barely running over it, you can see how the scratches are tracking evenly all the way through here, except for this one little area has a very slight ripple. When you see a car that has a finish that is that reflective, it's because the guy that did the body work is paying attention to that pressure and making sure that doesn't go away. A lot of guys will see this and then they just focus on that area with their hand. The goal here is that I don't focus that low spot with my hand pressure. I keep my hand out of it. If I go in an X pattern, I can iron this out most likely with the clear. But if my hand goes in there at any point, you'll see a scratch there. That's why I like to graze over all of my panels at the end so I can see what scratch is tracking evenly and what's not. Now you can see the difference in color here. From right here to here, we're still in the clear. This, being that we've really done a lot of heavy work to get this filler, this halo is the base color, the base coat showing, but this is where we're not hitting at all. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to work this down. I don't want to do a bunch of filler work up in this area. It wasn't that noticeable. What I'm trying to do is use the clear that we have on here as a barrier to try to iron out this as much as I can to be even less noticeable before breaking through. If I break through this clear over here, now I've got to bring in my base color and blend that much further. As long as I don't burn through the clear, I don't have to blend in this area. I just have to make sure I remove the sand scratch itself. The other thing is, if you guys watch this spot, you can see the clear is building up in there that's not touching. But no matter how I sand this, in either direction, I make sure these fingers don't go in there, or my hand does not go in there. If the low is smaller than my fist, then I can go over it because it's going to bridge that area. There's two ways you can go about this. I'm using a 1/4 inch block because we're just doing a little bit of finish work. Or I could go to a thicker block and I could come over this a little bit more. But no matter what, even if it's a 1/2 inch thick, where your hand placement is the only area that's actually going to make traction on the panel. So even with a 24-inch block, if my hands are here, spaced out evenly, the majority of the wear is only going to be here and only going to be here, even with a 1/2 inch block. I do this demonstration in our classes so that way people don't worry. They think because the block is this length, it's wearing everything over here down evenly. But if you're over here like this, you just made your block a smaller length, and whatever's over here hanging out, it might put a few little scratches here and there, but it's not wearing the panel down unevenly. It's only wearing the panel down where your hands are. Now, I don't want to scratch over there more than I have to, so I'm going to pivot to the block to use a smaller block, and I'm going to focus my pressure around the perimeter in that X pattern. You can see this base coat showing up more over here, but right here, still not showing. I'm trying to see if I can get away with not having to prime this area. But if I burn through anywhere here, I know I've got to blend my paint to that point anyway. So if that's the case, I would end up circling this, scuffing this up, putting a little tiny skim right there, and then just working that out. I've got to be getting a little bit on the thinner side out here. I think we're going to upgrade this area to be a 400 grit on here. It's going to take a little bit more effort, and we might have to change the paper a lot more. I want you guys to also pay attention to how your paper feels in the areas that are not wearing versus how's the areas that feel where you are making contact, because they really don't last that long. And if you have paper that's worn out, you are causing inconsistencies in your finish just because the paper is dull. It's faster, cheaper, especially if you're paying for labor. If you're retired and you got time, well, you're gonna end up causing irregularities because your paper's worn out. It's better to just buy more paper and use a nice grit that's cutting. It starts looking like it might be wearing through here, but we do still have some room to make this transition for blend, so might as well push it a little harder. Even though this just burned through the clear, you can notice that this is just now starting to actually track through, and I'm not putting, my finger can go right along the edge of that low. I'm just making sure my finger pressure is not going through the center. So if you're wondering why didn't I put filler here instead of bringing everything down and causing a burn through over here, really, I have enough space over here to make a blend still. I was trying to see how far could I get without having to have an area of filler up here where it's going to soak through. Now that I have an area where base coat is shown where I have to blend at a minimum just past this area, if you're thinking about it as the gun's coming over, basically I'll bring it in nice and tight, and then when I get right here, I'll whisk it out to where what you're left with is a few inches away from the end of the panel. You barely have any base coat. It's the original color and it will look seamless. But I was trying really hard to not put filler here because what it's going to do is it's going to soak up. So this area here, we're going to hit this harder with primer than we will be out here. I might have 3 coats of primer in here, so it's allowing for that product to dry and soak into the filler, where out here in base and clear, it's a product that's not porous, so it's not going to soak up into those areas, where down here will. I will focus more product and primer here than I will out here. This might get one quick little dust coat just to get in the scratches, and when I actually wet sand it out at the end after we do a final block in the primer stage, I don't care if I can see the sand scratches through the primer. We'll actually show you guys an area that we sand the primer out enough that the gray primer will be in the scratch only, and you will have unaffected clear and base out here at the ends. So it's just trying to keep your personal preference away from the edge. Right now, I was able to work this to where this is hitting, and I sacrificed a little bit of base coat here, but I still have enough room. If this was here, I wouldn't be doing this. I would have either made a decision on to leave that ripple or respray the door as well. That's up to you guys. Now that we've wiped everything off and you can see that it's hitting, we've confirmed that, we've gotten rid of the ripple, I'm going to come back through, guide coat a third time. I'm going to put 400 grit dry on here, and I'm going to work outward. You saw how far I pushed this area with 150 grit. I know I can push the area outside of that way farther with 400. So I'm going to take that down. That's why I'm always keeping track of how long did it take me with a nice fresh piece of paper to burn through that spot. That should be consistent with your paint job if you're walking it end to end. So I'm going to bring out, we had our 80 to here, then we worked out our 150 scratches a little further, and now we're going to come back through with 400. I don't really care so much about this area being 400, but I need a tooth everywhere out here that primer is going to be. And if I know I have 400 grit scratch out here when we're done, I can come back in after primer. I can remask this, so scuff maybe to here in 400, make a tape line, primer and blend out, and then when we actually wet sand, we're going to see a transition from all of this to be one uniform 600 grit scratch, knowing the base coat only has to come to here and blend. Now that we have 400 grit on here, my main focus is going to be where my primer is going to be thinner. I don't care so much about this being 400, I care about this section being a minimum of 400 to at least where the primer is going to hit. The other thing is, when I prime this, well, we'll get into it, I'll show you guys. I'm going to re-guide coat just to make sure I get rid of these aggressive scratches. Now, knowing that that spot that was the ripple and was low is now even, I can take the 400 with my hands evenly pressured and work through this area evenly to remove the rest. I don't have to worry about that spot until I got those scratches to go through. Now we're good to go. Constantly be looking at your paper to see, is it plugging up? Does it need new paper? Be listening to how much noise it makes as it scratches the surface. Does it sound the same as when you started? Don't keep going with worn out paper. This is another reason I use the 1/4 inch, because this will have the right curvature to bring my block downward and work out these areas. Because we don't have any body work over here to do, technically I could bring in a lot smaller block and just come out here and make sure that these areas are 400 only, and then we'll tape just shy of the area we don't want to get primer on. We do not want to make sure any primer gets on something that is not prepped. The other way you could have done this is just wet sand the whole fender in 600 grit before you do any repairs, and then you know you're prepped all the way to the edge. Doesn't matter how you do it as long as you make sure it's got a tooth somewhere, whatever product you put over the panel. Everything is in 400 grit from here out. This is a brand new microfiber right out of the package. I know some of you guys are going to say, well, you got bare hands. Been doing this long enough to know my hands are not oily. I can touch bare metal and not leave anything. It depends on your pH balance, how much you do body work. My hands are so dry that I've never had any problems in this long, but I would recommend wearing gloves if you are an oilier person. But at this point, I'm going to come in and I'm just going to mask off anything that's not prepped. The only reason I didn't wet sand this in the beginning was because of weather, and we wanted to get the car in the booth and not make a whole bunch of mess with water. I'll vacuum all this up. We'll mask this out. We're going to be using VP 2050. It is a DTM. Even though they call it a DTM, which is direct to metal, it's more of an epoxy based if you look at the chemical makeup. But it's kind of cool because it's doing two things with one product. It is not porous. It's going to seal up our filler work, but it is a high build. So you're getting the qualities of the epoxy and you're getting the qualities of a high build. It's like a polyester, but it's not porous. So once we'll start out with here in this area, blending it out, making sure the majority of our filler work ends up in the area of our repair. If you notice right here, we have burned through the clear, the base, and a hint of filler is showing from the primer from the very first go around. Really, that's where you should be with any of your sanding. You should see this stuff barely show up. We have our pencil line for our baseline for flat, and it's just carbon. We're going to go right back over all this and seal it up. And then once it dries and cures for a couple days, it depends on the job. This is just a repair. We can give this a day or two, block this back out, and the amount of product left on the vehicle is going to be pretty minimal. And then because it's not a polyester and it's sealed up, we'll be able to come in and guide coat this whole area, take the rest of the moldings off the fender, and we're going to wet sand everything to at least 600 grit. This is a solvent base coat. It's not a waterborne product, so it will cover more. So 600 is perfectly fine. But we're going to be going in and primering this, and we'll bring you back on the next step. I don't know how you want to do that. We're all masked off. At this point, we're going to mix up the primer, and we're going to blend the majority of our primer in here. Now, as you put on filler, more and more and more in areas, it becomes uneven. So if we know our primer is a high build, and it's not just a thin sealer, we want to try to put that on as even as possible. So that way when we come back to block out the primer, it is even. It's not a little bit here, a little bit there. We want to spray this as even as possible. We're going to be using the new Luma 3 gun. Full disclosure, Luma reached out to us and gave us these guns to try out, and we haven't made any money on these things at this time, but we do have an affiliate program with them now where I think this gun is a great gun for a guy starting out, and even a guy in the collision industry that maybe doesn't want to spend buku bucks on a Iwata or SATA. Me personally, I'm an Iwata guy from the start, and that's what I like. But I gotta say, this Exodus gun that they have out, it actually sprays really, really nice. And the other nice thing is if you guys are at home in your garage trying to do a repair and you don't have all of this lighting, these Luma 3 lights clip right onto the gun pretty easy. And if maybe you're doing a full car like we are in a booth, click of a button, you now have a sunlight that you can check your color, or you can get into a nook and cranny that are hard to see. So if you guys want to check these guns out, we do have a link that will be in the description with our discount code so you guys can give these a shot. When we talk about gun setup, I typically have a gun that I'm used to using where I know how many turns in on the paint flow, which is when you pull back on your trigger, how much product is physically coming out of the end of the gun. And then the fan being whether it's wide or whether it's narrow. Now, if this is the finished primer, I want it to be as smooth as possible, so I'm going to have a larger fan, especially when I'm going to unmask this and wet sand everything out so it blends nicely. Getting your gun to set up for whatever product you are going to use so you don't have inconsistent runs. When we talk about painting this evenly and all the way through, I don't want you guys to start practicing where you come in heavy and pull the trigger here and end here, because you are going to have a lot more product at your start and stops. I want you to get in the habit of always having the air on and don't let off. Anytime you're airbrushing or doing artwork, you always leave the air on. Same thing goes for doing a complete car or a repair job. You want to leave your air on, and if you have the paint needle set where you like it to where you don't have too much product for a run or too little of product to look dry, you're getting consistency all the way back. So if we pull the trigger back, and I dial this into where this needle feels like it just starts pushing on the trigger that way, that's where we start our 0. At that point, like right now, I can feel it's touching the trigger. Now I have the line on the back of the gun. I can dial it in 1 time, 2 times, 3 turns, whatever it is. And as you practice that product, you can be consistent with that product to get the same finish every time. So I will dial the gun in to what I like, and I will jot that down for this gun. That product sprays really nice, and every time I'm walking the length of the repair or the car, I have the same thickness all the way through, because the way that the gun itemizes on the panel, dependent on air pressure, how much product goes through the gun, that's going to look different as you block out the primer. You guys could see how you could see the different fills until we made everything even. Well, after we primer, we have to block the primer out so it looks even and uniform as well. It's different doing this for restoration work in a higher quality than it is to do collision work with collision products. A lot of the collision way is sand this filler to a finer grit, use a sealer, spray it, paint it, and ship it out the door. But the difference is in the restoration is we have a lot thicker, a lot higher quality products, higher solids than solvents. Meaning what product you put on the car is actually left on the car. It's not a solvent or a reducer that is going to flash off and leave and then shrink, and then you will see this repair later. Could you take a sealer and seal this and then go directly to base coat and clear coat? Sure. But the quality and the longevity is as that product dries and soaks into this area, and even that little hint right there, you will see it later. So if you prime this, give yourself a good 24 hours to dry and cure, or days to cure, the longer the better. This is going to have a lot better end result at the end of the time. We've shot the primer yesterday. We got the VP25 gun here. We ended up doing about 3 coats. I've noticed that the primer is it's a very thick primer, so its mix ratio is 2:1 by half of the reducer. I like to mix it 2:1:1. It's adding just a very little bit more of reducer so it flows a little bit nicer, especially for a spot repair like we're doing here. Now that we have that 3 coats, while it was still masked off, I went ahead and I used a SEM Guide Coat Black product. I used this instead of the powder before we've sanded, because if you use the Mirka dry powder over a freshly smooth surface, it won't stick. So I bounce back and forth between a spray guide coat and a powder. The next thing we've done is we walked you guys through block sanding all the filler all the way to 150 grit. Now, there's a million ways you can slice this, but the one thing that I do is when I prime, I come back with the grit that I ended with. So this is back to 150 grit on the blocks. And the reason that I do that is because as the paint itemizes, the primer itemizes onto the panel, you may have a pinhole or something that you had to come back and hit. So we try to do it all uniform, but especially for a first prime over filler work, that almost never happens. So if you find pinhole and you come back and hit it here, well, that area is going to be thicker. If we come back in with 150 grit and block this back down, we are going to see where those inconsistencies are with that guide coat. We want to just do a quick block out with 150. The goal here is not to burn through, but if you do burn through and you do have any filler showing, you just got to re-spot prime it in and then wet sand it out. So the goal here is do a quick block out just to remove any of that inconsistency. Could you go to 600 wet? Sure, but your car is going to look a little bit more wavy because you're not taking out that texture, that inconsistency in your priming. So that's what we're going to do with this, is just level the playing field in the primer. When you put filler on, you put it on in different sections, and when you put primer on, the goal is that it's uniform so it's smoother. That's only a couple swipes, and you can see exactly where our filler is. This is the reason that it is soaked up. Although this is an epoxy high build, it still soaks up any material that goes into it because it's porous. This is the reason that you have to block this back out. So if we think about using a sealer over any filler work and going directly to paint, that's why you see it, because it's soaked in one area and not the other. Everything that still has clear or base coat or anything non-porous is not going to do that. So we're just using this primer to block this down even enough that we don't have any visual line around that area. Knowing that, if you have a small quarter piece or a dime spot showing of filler, I highly recommend spraying primer back over it, letting that fully dry 24 hours. Sometimes if it's hot enough, you can wait just a couple hours and then wet sand that back out. That's enough of a barrier that you're not going to have a soak up spot later show up in your clear. Now that we have taken everything down with 150 grit, there's barely any little tiny low spots showing. We are not going to see any difference in filler, but this is where if you did have an area that burned through, you're going to want to spot prime that back in. And then at that point, you're just taking care of little areas that you can come back in and feather out. So here, we're going to use that same little next level block that's real flexible. Somewhere. And we're going to do the same thing because we had some pretty aggressive scratches through this area. We don't want to take off so much material that we don't have anything to still work farther. This is why I like this product, because it's such a thick product that by the time you block it, most of our cars we block with 150 grit after priming, then we guide coat. We block with 220 grit, we guide coat, and then I go from 220 grit to 600 wet. And because it's not a porous product, you can wet sand it. Some guys will dry sand to 400. Can you? Sure, you can. You just might see 400 scratches come back later. You can slice this a bunch of different ways. You could use sealer, you could wet sand your sealer, but trying to do this the fastest from point A to point B. We're trying to get through wet sand to 6, seal, paint, and go for it. The one thing I was trying not to do in the beginning was have a tape line where there's heavy primer between the two, but then you guys aren't going to learn anything from this. So if you were to wet sand this and you think you got it smooth by feel, I assure you, you will see this in the reflection. It will look like a small step right here. In order to get rid of it, I'm going to take that 150 grit. Well, you guys saw when I worked the clear a little bit to get rid of that ripple, that there's enough clear on this car that I can very lightly take this, and I'm focusing my finger pressure onto the side with the primer. So that way I can get rid of this step and make it blend out. And even though I'm using 150 grit in clear, I know that I have enough product that I can come back in and wet sand that 150 grit scratch completely away. Now you guys can see it, a very defined line. Now, is that good enough? No. We want to actually wear this away to where you have an area that is smooth and is going to blend. You guys will see this more when we wet sand it, but we don't want a defined line. It has to blend out and be smooth between the two transitions. Now, even though I'm holding this block over the line, my focus on the pressure is more on the primer side because it's going to get worn down faster than the lower side. Just like that. Although this is that 150, we will wet sand it very thoroughly with guide coat. It's the same thing we do with color sanding and polishing. Put the guide coat, the dry mica, into those 150 scratches and make sure they are completely gone before we go into sealer. As I was spraying the primer, I made sure that my gun left less material near the edge of my paint and my tape, or my primer and my tape. That way this wasn't as bad as trying to block down the bulk of the product over here. We already know that that's going to soak up into it, so we want to have the bulk of the product there so we have enough material to block down. Pay attention to your repairs as you guys do them. If you used 2 coats on that car, track that. Was it enough? Did you need to add more? Was your body work where you needed it to be? And the goal is that when you're all done, you have enough here that you can do this in one shot. When you're doing a complete, the goal is always to set out and try to body work and prime the car one time. Not always do you get one time, and that's with the exception of a few little spot primes and breakthroughs throughout the project. But if your body work is to that level, you should be able to get the majority of the car blocked out and looking even in that coat. You just have to know where your filler work needs to be, how much primer you're using, because a lot of these 4-to-1 primers and DTMs that people use, they're so thin, a few swipes of that 150 and it's already showing body filler. That's why I like this product. It's a little more pricey, but you're not spending more time, more labor. So really, what's more pricey? Your time or the product that you pay a little bit more for that's going to take you farther? So we got rid of all of these lines. We're going to get rid of this little line. Everything up here, I can still see a hint of blue through, and I'm not going to take 150 to it. It will blend out just fine when we get to 600. Something I'm doing in these tight areas, in these crevices, is I'm taking the block and I'm tipping it up on edge and curving it and acting as if it's like a file. Because sometimes if you sit here and go hold the block flat and just keep moving, within a pass or two, you're creating a groove that's going to be seen. So if you put it on edge and rock through the two shapes, you can wear it evenly to where you're not going to have that area, but you have to get it initially flat. This is one shape, this is another shape, and separate them. And at the end, you basically work on blending them all together. But you can see here, straight line, it's starting to fade here. Now, if you look at it, look how uneven this is. You're not going to see that defined primer line. That's what you want. And we're going to take this down all the way to 600. It's going to fade and blend even more. You're going to see all of this overspray. It has a tooth from the 400 grit that we went over it, but it's going to feather out really nicely where we have it just blended and thin. At this point, I'm going to take care of just this little bit right here. Hopefully we don't go through. Right now we have no burn throughs. We've left that little bit out, so we got to wet sand that. What happens if you burn through an area in the primer and we have some of the 400 grit showing? Because I guarantee that's going to be a question. Doesn't matter. All that matters is that wherever you burn through, there's not something porous below it. Body filler, poly primer. We don't have any poly primer on this car, but those are the things that you want to be concerned about. Just making sure that one product can go over the other one smoothly. If you do have a hint of filler showing, you could take the sealer that you're going to use and spray the sealer over it, let the sealer dry, and then come back in and wet sand your sealer. Just depends on how much area you're trying to cover. What are the ways that you can pivot and fix that situation? At this point, we're done. We're going to blow it off. We're going to guide coat it. I'm going to grab 600 with a squirt bottle and water. And I'm going to block all of this out, and we will be able to check our finish on this repair before we even go to paint with a like 90 panel check. So we'll roll right into that. What block do you guys use when you are wet sanding? There's a variation of things you can do. You can use a soft block that has holes in it and is very flexible. I would say it depends on what your process is. If you're using Durablocks that are not rigid and they're not acrylic like the next level blocks, then this is sufficient. It's fine. When we take something this flat and we try to keep that all the way through to the end, I like to use the smaller block. Now, why wouldn't we wet sand with a larger block? Because remember, we're doing body work and we're doing filler work from 80 grit to 150 grit. I mean, you can use whatever you guys want outside of that, but the majority of the cutting it down, is 80 to 150. Outside of that, we are refining scratches. I like Jason Kilmer's Jason Kilmer's personal blocks. So he hand makes all these. This is an acrylic. I believe this one's 3/8 or half. I don't think that's half inch, but it has a foam, and the foam is not the same as any other foam. It's a very firm foam. He has different ones, but the cool thing about it is if we have all of this dead flat already and we're in 150 grit, you can go to 220. You can go to 400. This is not the only way. This is just what I have found that works the best for me. But the other cool thing is, most of the time when you use these blocks, you're cutting one of these sheets of 600 in half, and you're using one full sheet to do this section. Where Jason's block, you're only using a fraction. You might even cut that into fours for that half. Your paper is going to go a lot farther, and you can keep swapping it out. And you're going to hold out because it's acrylic. It's going to hold out your finish. We're not worried about straightness and waviness. Now, if you sit in one spot and you just grind forever with 600, yeah, you'll cause ripples. But if you move around and keep that 600 moving, you're not going to have any problems. You have to constantly be thinking about your grit. How much grit does it take to cut something flat after clear? Our color sand videos that we show, it covers all of those things. We use the acrylic side from 600 to 1,000, and then we flip it over and we use the foam side of the block because it's already cut flat. You're just getting rid of scratches at that point. 600 grit, just some water. Sometimes you can put a drop of soap in a squirt bottle. It helps it slide a little bit more. Also notice I put the Mirka guide coat even all the way out to the 400 scratch. As we've gone out, again, it's easier to just do it 600 grit from the very beginning. But one thing that does has an advantage here is that I am making sure that even the 400 grit scratch is completely eliminated in this step. And we're going to end up remasking the entire car before we paint because I don't want any of this dust to go into our paint job. So I'm just going to get this done. We're going to unmask, and then I will wet sand the entire fender edge to edge and where I'm going to make all my tape lines. .600 grit is done, at least for the gray area. And I'm just going to use a brand new, another microfiber. I know some of you guys are going, why don't you use the other towels? They're less costly. Nothing in restoration is cheap. I like these because they stay wet and damp when I'm using my wax and grease removers and my waterborne cleaners. But I just want to show you guys what the goal is. You do not want any guide coat left behind. Every scratch needs to be out that is black. So I clean it, I wipe it down, and I look at it, and it's going to get gone over again when I unmask. So if this fender was all blue, we would have to tape it all the way to the edge where it meets the hood, where it meets the door, and so forth under here. And you would have to blend the color and whisk out. The big thing is if you're blending and you're holding it perpendicular and you just stop, that area that you stop, the metallics are not going to blend into the color that you had before. So you want to cover, like I'm going to cover this in a sealer, and a sealer is used to get the color closer to your base coat so you're not having to paint a whole bunch of base coat. Another scenario that you could do is what if, well, and I don't know, it might even be our situation because I haven't looked to see how much paint we had left from a couple years ago for this car. But if you only got a little tiny bit of base coat left, go to your local paint supply house or mix it yourself and try to get the same color. If you use a color code, when you paint the car, we'll just get the same color code. And if not, then get it color matched close to. It doesn't have to be perfect. But what you're doing is you're putting a ground coat on that's going to get you really close just to cover the primer gray over your sealer, right? And then use that last little bit of the original paint to go over this and whisk out your ends all the way. And the goal is that you're not using base coat up to where it meets the door. You want to come just shy. If you are doing a repair that is close to the door, you need to blend into the door. You're going to have to use your own judgment on that, but gun setup is crucial. That's why when we paint a car, we note all of that stuff so that way we can replicate it again when we have a repair like this. It's not often, but when you need it, it's there. So we will come through and I will seal up this. It's going to be a dark gray sealer. This dark blue is going to cover over the dark gray sealer a lot easier than it will be over this lighter color. And I'm pretty sure we almost ran out of paint on this car initially, so we should have a color that we can get the majority covered. And I will use the original paint only at the end to make my blend. But the biggest thing is whisking out your gun. And when you're doing the very last coat, if you guys haven't seen our paint video about how we get the gun dialed, and then at the very end, when you're doing an orientation coat where the metallics lay evenly so you don't get tiger stripes or blotchiness, you turn your pressure back to like 10 to 12 PSI, and I just feather it. What that's doing is putting a little bit bigger of a droplet. It is not a dry coat. A bigger droplet is a bigger droplet, but it is wet and it is still sticking to the panel. It is not a dry coat. A dry coat would be a high pressure, so it's itemizing to a small particle and you're farther away. That is a dry coat. It's not adhering to the panel. We are still going to paint it 6 to 8 inches away. We are still going to use the same needle settings. We are just going to change the air pressure to get that itemization and those metallics to look uniform. Down at the bottom, we shouldn't have to do anything. We're just going to blend just past the primered area. And then when we're done with the base coat, we are then going to clear the entire area. We got lucky because it's a two-tone car. I can make my tape line right underneath the molding. And I'm gonna take the headlight ring off, and we will just have to paint this area of blue, and then I will re-clear to the molding line. There is a hint of blue showing right here, and we know our filler work is right here. So even if you see pencil lines wearing through, that just tells me that my primer is as thin as it can be. You're not getting excessive buildup. If I can see that, I know there's not much more there to block. But if I don't see those things and I want to check the panel to see, did I take care of the damage? We wore all this area down and dished it out to where it was sticking good and not delaminating. But you guys can use whatever you want. But if you use wax and grease remover, if you use waterborne cleaner and you spray the panel and you side it using the shine, yes, that works. But if you want something that's going to spray more like a clear and actually level out, when you're shooting wax and grease, it's like water and it runs, and you will get ripples in just that finish. And that's where I do like a Like 90 product. Now, Like 90, although they give us product and they like our channel and they sponsor us, I don't get any kickbacks for this, but I do like to support a small company that has a product that I use and that I like. I'm not going to promote something that I don't like. So this product is neat because you can spray the panel very evenly and uniformly. And with lighting, I can look at my repair. This will level out. And I can see if my body work looks nice and straight or if I have a grooved area and I need to do more sanding. Obviously, because that's showing blue, if that was the case and I wasn't happy with it, I might have to reprime this and block it again. Don't jump to paint. Paint is way too expensive these days. It's nice to have a security check, as I call it, because now you can make sure it's going to be good. The other thing is, if this is sprayed over your panel and you see things where it's separating, maybe you got oil, maybe you got a separation. For the price of a can of this, it's going to show you how well your panel is prepped. Doesn't matter if you're using solvent-based paint or waterborne paint. Waterborne paint is going to like another level of detail. We shoot both here, but this car shot a few years ago. We have solvent, so we're going to use the same exact paint going forward. But just a quick little tip on making sure everything is dialed into where you want it. You can just wipe it off with a nice clean rag and roll right into your sealer. I want to elaborate on one thing that might be a gray area for you guys, and that's, we talk about using the sealer. We're going to use a sealer that covers the light gray with a dark gray. The dark gray is going to cover a lot easier with the blue. We covered that. But what happens when you spray your sealer and that sealer goes just a little farther towards the door than you wanted, and now you don't have that initial base color to blend to the door? Well, you can let that dry, let it flash. Depending on your weather, you might be able to wait 15 minutes. You might be able to wait an hour or 2 hours and come back in with that same 600, or you can even use 800 grit, and you can sand that sealer off. Have a visual, take pictures of your work so you know where your split line is, and maybe you take a measurement of 10 inches from your door. You just need enough room to blend that color. I have gotten away with just a few inches. The more room, the better. If you start getting less than 4 inches, I would probably just blend into the door panel. But overall, shoot the sealer. If you're too close, you can wet sand the sealer off in that area. At that point, if you see any dust nibs, you can wet sand the dust nibs out and just put one nice uniform coat of sealer. The thing is, paint wants to go over something that is uniform. It doesn't want to go over something that is polyester and something that has filler showing and something that has paint showing. It wants to go over one smooth surface. That's why we use sealer. And we use sealer because it's giving us adhesion chemically. So it's giving us adhesion mechanically to the 600 scratch, and it's giving us adhesion chemically to the base coat and clear coat. That's how that works. So you kind of need to make this sandwich up. But overall, right now we are going to take the gun in. We're going to unmask, remask the whole car, get everything clean, spray the boot down. This is the Like 90 pig mat. We are going to vacuum, spray down our dust particle control, remask everything very detailed to our edges and our split lines, and then we will come through and we will be spraying our sealer. You can come in perpendicular here and then whisk it out. I most likely will wet sand that area to make sure there is no sealer in the area that I need a blend. You don't want any particles of gray sticking out there far where you missed, and then when you clear it, you see it later. Make sure everything is done. Even if you're just trying to get your sealer, mask off the area that you want to blend, keep this protected, and then all you have to do is do the same thing we did here with the sealer. Remove that sharp edge, and then you can move on and you have something that you know for a fact has the original paint and you're not having specks of something showing down the line. We want this to look seamless. We want you guys to be able to repair this because this is a very costly thing to do if you were to take this to another shop. So I think at the end we'll talk about how many hours did this take start to finish, how much did it cost in materials, just so you guys have an idea. And if you guys are a shop owner and you're trying to educate your customers, you have to be able to have a leg to stand on. Otherwise, people don't understand how long this takes to do. What is that process? Everybody thinks you just scuff it and you shoot it and you move on. And not all processes are the same, but if you don't educate them on what your process is, it's hard to argue. So that's why we take pictures, we document, we have our classes. If you guys haven't looked, sylvesterscustoms.com. All this info is on there about what we teach and what we cover. We have people flying from all over the US, and we cover all these different scenarios. The more questions we get, the more in depth we go. But we're going to unmask, remask, get the sealer ready, and show you guys how to spray this thing. I opened up the trunk of the car that my uncle had the original paint from, and what we were actually left with was, no joke, ½ inch of paint in the bottom of the gallon of the original color. But I did notice that from the previous time we painted it, we had some other batches that we had mixed for that initial coat. So we used the new paint, not the original. So we just had the same color remixed. But again, when it comes to making it look seamless from one panel to the other and having an area to blend, we want to preserve that last little bit in the gallon to be able to go over it. So we took the new paint that we color matched and we just did the majority of the area over the sealer. And as we shoot that over the sealer, when you get to the end where you have your area that's going to blend, you just want to whisk out the gun ever so slightly. You don't want to cover it completely, so focus your main area to be over the sealer to get coverage where you don't have that primer halo showing in the fender of the paint. So once you get that covered with the newly mixed base coat, then you're going to come back in with the original paint that we had, that last little bit. Clean out the gun. I make sure everything is only that batch. And what I do is I usually do the orientation coat. Orientation coat being the metallics you don't want to look splotchy. You don't want to see tiger stripes. You want it to look very uniform. And when we did that, we didn't change any of our needle or fan settings. We just took our air pressure from about 30, 35 PSI, depending on the gun, and we turned it down to 10 to 15 PSI. What that's going to do is going to give you the bigger droplet that's going to not be a dry spray. Some people will mistake that for dry spray and it's not adhering. No, dry spray is when your air pressure is turned up too high and you're back too far and it's itemized so small that it becomes almost a dust and it's not adhering. By turning the pressure down, you have a bigger droplet, and that bigger droplet is getting good adhesion to the panel. But what it's doing is it's spraying more uniform. It's taking, when you turn your air pressure up, things look splotchy. If you guys want a demonstration of that, take black paint, spray it over a panel with high pressure, and if you want to see how the itemization looks closer together and more uniform, just turn your pressure down. That's how you can start dialing in your spray patterns with that particular gun that you're going to use. So as you whisk out the paint and it gets to the end of the fender, you want very little base coat to be at the edge of the fender. You want the original color under the clear to only be showing, so that way you don't see any difference between the fender and the door. And at that point, it's going to look a little funky because you have raw base coat going over clear. Don't freak out. When you go to clear over the two, it basically makes it look like it's on one level instead of being under clear and over clear. And what it will do is it makes it look seamless. At that point, you just need to determine how much room you need for your blend, whether that be a small area or a larger area. Hopefully you have enough room, or just go to the next panel and do the same thing and blend into the door if you're worried about that scenario. If you guys want to know more about our actual paint process for doing a complete, you can check out the video we did with the Lincoln. It's a 63 Lincoln. We did a dark blue, and we go through every bit of the process on how we paint an entire car from start to finish. What does a repair like this take? As far as hours, cost, it's December of 2023, and we just want everybody to understand, because I think there's a lot of people that want to argue, why does certain repairs cost so much these days? And this might be used for a guy in his garage, or it might be used for a guy in his shop who's trying to educate his customer as to what that path looks like and the costs associated. Start to finish, and that's from stripping it all the way back down, feathering this out, primering it, blocking it, sealing it, everything. We have about 22 hours in just this fender. Just that small repair from start to finish. And you figure if that's at an $85 an hour rate, that's about $1,870. And I think that's very fair. There are shops in our area that are almost double that rate. But paint materials, you're looking at $453 and some change just to be able to make this blend. And that's if you have the paint that you're going to repair the base coat with. That wraps up this how-to for you guys. I hope you guys got something out of it. If you guys want to know more about color sanding and polishing, check out our other videos. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you guys on the next one.